And then we're moving on to the last talk before our panel session. The next speaker is Shalini De Mello. She is a principal research scientist at NVIDIA and received her PhD from UT Austin. She has been working on self-supervised and few-shot learning, 3D reconstruction, viewpoint estimation, and human-computer interaction. And a lot of this work has also already been on 3D objects in the wild, images and videos, and that's why the talk is going to be very fitting for our workshop, and we're very excited to hear about part correspondences and temporal consistency. The talk will be pre-recorded, if I understand correctly, and then you will be here for questions afterwards.
That's right.
Hi, my name is Shalini De Mello, and I'm a principal research scientist in the Learning and Perception Research Group at NVIDIA. Among other things, I'm interested in learning with less labels and data, and also in 3D reconstruction. In line with the theme of this workshop, my talk is going to try and answer the question of whether we can use object part or temporal correspondences learned in a self-supervised manner to help us to improve 3D reconstruction of objects in the wild. Today I will describe two of our recent works that explore 3D mesh reconstruction in the wild. One which uses single view images and the other that exploits temporal information from videos. The first work that I will describe is called Self-Supervised Single View 3D Reconstruction via Semantic Consistency and was published at ECCV last year. The task that we're trying to solve is as follows. Given a collection of images of a specific category, we wish to accomplish two things. The first is to learn a category-specific 3D template from scratch, as shown in the top figure A, where we learned this template for the bird category. And the second is to learn instance-specific mesh reconstructions based on the learned template. We assume that the only supervision that we have is the collection of images themselves and a silhouette mask of the foreground object in each image. To solve this task, we adopt Angju Kanazawa's awesome work on category-specific mesh reconstruction from ECCV 2018. In CMR, the model takes a single view image as an input and jointly predicts texture, the deformation of a 3D mesh template shape, and the camera viewpoint. In this work, the texture is represented as a texture flow that maps pixels from the input RGB image to the UV space. One of the nice things about this design is that the texture flow can map anything from the input 2D image space to the UV map space. For example, here it maps part segments or key points of a bird image to the UV space, which can further be mapped to the 3D mesh. This key idea plays a central role in the two projects that we will describe today. In its shape branch, CMR predicts the offset to be applied to each vertex of a 3D template shape. It models the camera as a weak perspective camera that basically tells us from which view the image is captured given the 3D mesh. Then it uses a differentiable renderer that takes the textured mesh and the camera viewpoint as input and outputs the rendered image. If the predicted camera viewpoint and the 3D shape and its texture are correct, then the rendered image should look like the input image, and we can use this photometric consistency between the two images as an objective for training. Besides comparing images, CMR also renders a foreground mask and compares it against the ground truth foreground mask. So that's the basic framework of CMR. However, in CMR, there's an assumption that both a category-specific 3D shape template and the viewpoints of all images are known a priori. Specifically, the viewpoints are computed from 2D key point annotations on images. However, this requirement makes it challenging to generalize CMR to other objects in the wild, for example to horses, cows, or even penguins, where we may not have the 3D template shapes or 2D key point annotations. So in our work, we focus on self-supervised single-view 3D reconstruction, where there are no ground truth 2D keypoint, 3D templates, or viewpoint annotations available. However, if we directly remove the camera viewpoints and the 3D templates from CMR, not surprisingly, the results become unrealistic, especially from unobserved views. Observe the red box. Here we reconstruct a bird from its side view, but if we view the reconstruction from the front side, it doesn't look like a bird at all. This is due to the inherent camera shape ambiguity present in the problem of single-view 3D reconstruction. To understand this better, let's look at another example. Here, given the image on the left, we show two possible reconstructed meshes and predicted camera viewpoints in the middle and their respective rendered images on the right. Although both the rendered images match the input image, the prediction in the first row has incorrect shape and wrong camera viewpoint. But note one key observation here. Since we obtain the shape of a particular object instance by deforming or moving the vertices of a 3D template mesh, the semantic part labels across the different mesh reconstructions should all be the same. For example, if the red part of the template represents the head of the bird, but during deformation, the first row incorrectly deforms it to be the tail, we know that the shape predicted in the first row is incorrect. So in order to make correct shape predictions, we need to make sure that the semantic part labels of the vertices on the template do not change. But the question is, how do we know which semantic part of the bird each vertex on the mesh belongs to? Although it is hard to get part information on 3D, we can obtain semantic parts across instances on 2D images using a self-supervised approach such as SCOPS, and from there we can eventually get the part labels on 3D meshes. As shown here, these parts are consistent and correspond to each other. For instance, all red parts in these bird images indicate heads, while the green parts look like their necks. In a correctly learned 3D reconstruction network, the part label of each point on the reconstructed mesh's surface should be consistent, however the shape of the bird may change. For example, here vertices labeled in yellow will always represent the wing part in the reconstructions, however the template is deformed. So how can we map these semantic parts from 2D to 3D to regularize our model? Recall that we can use the texture flow learned by a reconstruction model to map the semantic parts in 2D images to the UV space. We then average all semantic UV maps to get a canonical UV map. The average operation cancels out noise in each individual semantic UV map caused by inaccurate texture flow or occlusion. This obtained canonical semantic UV map is shared by all instances of the same category and assigns a part label for each point on the reconstructed mesh. In the dash box, we can see that by warping the semantic UV map onto these meshes, we're able to know which parts on the meshes are heads and which are wings, etc. So similarly, we can warp the canonical semantic UV map to the estimated shape and compare its rendering with the 2D semantic part segmentation that we obtained from SCOPS. If both the shape and the camera viewpoint are correct, then the rendering will match the 2D semantic part segmentation of the 2D image. Thus, we can use this loss to correct the predicted camera viewpoint and the shape. The effectiveness of the semantic consistency constraint can be visualized by this example. Given a flying bird like this, the model learned without the semantic consistency constraint reconstructs a bird that matches the image and its foreground mask. However, if we warp the canonical semantic UV map onto the reconstructed mesh, we find that the head part of the template is incorrectly deformed to form the wing, and hence is not consistent with the other instances from the category. But by adding the semantic consistency constraint, the camera viewpoint and the shape can both be corrected, and the semantic part label on the reconstruction will be consistent with the other instances from the category. So that's the semantic consistency constraint that we introduce in this work, which allows us to reduce ambiguity if we don't have camera viewpoint supervision. Another goal of this work is also to learn a category-specific 3D template mesh from scratch using only the collection of 2D images available to us. To learn the template shape, we start from a sphere and update it every k epochs during training. Each update introduces more details to the template until finally we get this template that looks pretty much like a bird. For each update, we first use the encoder to extract features of all training samples and then feed the average feature to the decoder. The output of the decoder is used to update the current template to a new template. Here we summarize our self-supervised single-view reconstruction framework. Our main contributions are a semantic consistency constraint that helps to jointly learn camera viewpoint and 3D shape reconstruction, and a progressive method to learn a 3D template shape for a category from scratch. Here we show some qualitative results on bird images. Our model can successfully reconstruct different types of birds, such as ducks, larger birds, or even a painting of a bird, as shown in the last column. We also train our model on rigid objects like cars and motorbikes and are able to successfully reconstruct them. And also on non-rigid objects like zebras, horses, and cows. Here I also show some quantitative evaluations of the proposed method. We use the intersection over union or IOU metric for object mass and the PCK metric for the key point transfer task. I will skip the details of the evaluation process, but the results here show that our method performs on par with methods that require supervision from 2D key points or category-specific 3D templates for learning to reconstruct from single-view images. So to summarize, in this work, we learn a single-view mesh reconstruction model and a category-level template. We learned this model from only a collection of images and silhouettes. Specifically, by utilizing cross-instance correspondences, we are able to reduce ambiguity of single-view reconstruction and jointly learn both the camera viewpoint and 3D shape reconstruction. So that was all with regards to mesh reconstruction from images. Now, if you consider the temporal correspondence of frames in videos and this mesh reconstruction network for images that we've just learned, one natural thought is how we can combine the two to solve the problem of video mesh reconstruction. This was the exact challenge that we set out to solve in the work titled Online Adaptation for Consistent Mesh Reconstruction in the Wild, which we published last year at NeurIPS, and I will be describing this work next. In this work, we proposed a semi-supervised method to reconstruct temporally consistent 3D meshes of deformable object instances from videos in the wild. Most existing work on dynamic mesh reconstruction relies on strong shape priors. For example, the SMPL model for the human body or the 3D morphable model for dynamic faces is often used for reconstructing 3D faces or human bodies. Our work, on the other hand, focuses on reconstructing animals from videos in the wild. This is a more challenging task in the sense that we don't have access to any 3D scans of these animals and hence do not have any kind of shape prior for them, because it's virtually impossible to scan these sorts of wild animals in controlled environments. So the question is, how can we reconstruct these animals simply from their 2D videos? So one simple and naive solution that comes to mind is to apply the single view image reconstruction model that I described earlier independently to each individual frame of the video. However, on doing so, the reconstructed object shows temporal discontinuities in shape and flickering camera viewpoints. This happens due to many reasons. First of all, most of the videos we found on the internet are captured by mobile phones, and they contain low-quality video frames, small objects, and appearance variations like lighting, etc. Almost all of them also have large domain gaps with the image data sets, like the ones that we use for training the single view reconstruction models. Another solution is to annotate the bird videos as much as possible so that we can retrain the image-based models for the video domain. However, to annotate all frames of videos is never easy. It requires extensive human labor, and we cannot guarantee the coherence of the annotations. So the question is, how can we resolve all these issues to be able to reconstruct wild animals in videos? In this work, we propose an online adaptation approach as a solution. We first train a single view reconstruction network using a group of annotated images. During testing, we fine-tune the network to let it adapt to a specific video. Online adaptation is also called test time training. The benefit and the difficulty here is that we do not have any labels on the test data, which is in our case of the testing video. So we need to figure out effective self-supervised objectives that we can improve the network with during test time training. So let's first look more carefully at the improved single view reconstruction model that we introduced as part of this work. So recall the single view image reconstruction model that we described in the earlier part of this talk that jointly predicts both the texture, the shape, and the camera viewpoint based on Angju's CMR paper. So the CMR method is mainly designed for symmetric objects. However, what if the objects are not symmetric? For instance, when a bird rotates its head as shown in the pictures on the right. So in this work, we dropped the symmetry assumption of CMR and modeled asymmetric objects as well. To model an asymmetric object, instead of directly estimating the coordinates of its 3D vertices, we decomposed the representation of the shape of the object into a combination of basis shapes and additionally vertex offsets applied on top of the base combination. The base combination is still symmetric, while the deformation delta V is not. And that, in our case, can be used to model subtle asymmetric motion, like that of the head rotation of the bird or the motion of its wings, etc. To obtain a set of base shapes, we apply k-means clustering to all the mesh reconstructions obtained from the single view reconstruction framework that we discussed previously. As you can observe here, a base shape discovered in this manner corresponds somewhat to the identity of an instance. For example, it could be an ordinary bird, a flying bird, or a duck, etc. Observe that for a single video clip, since the characteristics of a bird don't change, for example, whether the bird is a duck or a large bird, these attributes stay constant for the bird throughout the video. So during test time training, we enforce the predictions of the base combination shapes, or more specifically the coefficients beta in our case, to be the same for different frames in a short video clip. We will talk about and discuss these constraints more in detail in the latter part of this talk. So much like the prior CMR work, we train the single view based image reconstruction model in this work with supervision from ground truth 2D silhouette masks, images, and known camera viewpoints, along with surface smoothing regularization terms. However, differently from the prior work, to enable greater dynamic deformation of the 3D surface across the video, we further utilize a key point matching loss, which we will describe next in detail. So as shown here, given an instance, if we know both its 2D key points and their corresponding 3D key points on the mesh, we can encourage our model to correctly deform the 3D shape by matching the projections of the 3D key points to their 2D key point annotations. But the question is, how can we obtain both the 2D key points with their corresponding 3D key points on the mesh's surface? So our solution is as follows. For the 2D key points, we employ ground truth annotations. And to find the 3D key points, we compute aggregated key point heat maps using the texture flow. So the key insight that we use to find the corresponding 3D key points is the fact that each semantic key point is always mapped to the same point on the template mesh's surface, no matter how the template is deformed, which is the same idea that we used previously to solve the camera viewpoint and shape ambiguity in the self-supervised single view reconstruction work. So practically what we do is that we first represent the 2D key point annotation as a heat map on the image. And then we use the learned texture flow to map these heat maps onto the UV space, as is shown in this image. We average all the UV heat maps to get a canonical key point UV map. This key point UV map is shared by all instances and indicates the location of each semantic key point on the 3D mesh. Furthermore, we can also use the learned canonical key point UV map to find semantic key points on each individual reconstruction for each instance. For example, the orange circle that you see in this image here represents the tail key point in each bird instance for each reconstruction. So notice that if the shape is reconstructed correctly, then the projections of the 3D key points onto the rendered image should match exactly the input 2D key points that are provided as ground truth annotations. So we explicitly enforce this key point matching loss to encourage the model to learn to reconstruct better shapes by matching 3D key point projections to their ground truth 2D locations. We find that the key point matching loss pushes the 3D key points to correct locations in the 3D space and leads to greater deformation of the 3D meshes. However, one issue is that instead of correctly deforming the overall shape of the object under consideration, this loss can sometimes result in noisy reconstructions with many spikes and a rough 3D surface to satisfy the key point reconstruction constraint, as shown in the red box. And in order to resolve this issue, we also utilize the as rigid as possible or ARAP constraint to encourage consistent local surface deformation in the base combination mesh and the final reconstruction. The intuition here is that the base combination shape will always be a smooth surface. Thus, its local graph should be preserved during motion deformation. Here we show more results of this improved single view image reconstruction model, where our method is able to capture non-symmetric motion such as rotation of the head of the bird, as you can observe from the images. Now let's switch gears and talk about how we employ this improved single view reconstruction model to a series of video frames of an instance of an object to obtain temporally consistent mesh reconstructions. As we mentioned before, once we have the image reconstruction model, if we directly apply it to each frame of the video, the reconstruction will be incorrect and inconsistent, as you can see here. Also note that for videos, the setting that we assume is that we only have access to foreground mass for each frame, but without any other information such as the presence of 3D meshes or 2D key points on the frames, etc. So to solve this problem and to obtain coherent reconstructions across a video, we propose to use an online adaptation procedure on each testing video. The key idea here is that even if we only have one video, we can still adapt the image reconstruction model to it by exploring self-supervision signals for online adaptation. So the key to enabling online adaptation is to find self-supervision signals in unlabeled test videos besides the foreground object mass that we have available for them. we find that there are several inherent properties of objects with respect to their shape, texture, and random part correspondences that are invariant to the shape deformation caused by the non-rigid motion of the object. During test time training, we enforce these properties to be consistent among different frames of the same video clip. For shape invariance, as we discussed previously, since the identity or characteristics of an object, or of the bird in our case, don't change over time, we enforce that the predicted base combination shape of the object be consistent across all frames of the video. For texture consistency or texture invariance, we enforce that the predicted UV texture map of an object be consistent for each frame of the video over time. Besides the temporal shape and texture consistency constraints, we also explore a part invariance constraint which is defined in the UV space. In order to compute the UV parts constraint, we paint random strips only on the object in the first frame and propagate them across all the remaining frames of the video. Previously, we had also developed a method to learn dense correspondences across video frames in a self-supervised manner, which works quite well at propagating object part strips across frames. For the task of video object reconstruction as well, we can similarly propagate the random strips from the first frame to the rest of the video using a self-supervised method for establishing dense correspondences between video frames. After that, we map the individual parts to the UV space using the learned texture flow for each frame and average across all the frames to obtain a more reliable UV parts map. We warp the average UV parts map onto the predicted shape for each video frame and render it back to the 2D space with the predicted camera viewpoint. We then compare the rendered UV part projections to their original propagated strip versions for the 2D input frames. And by comparing them against the original propagated strips in 2D, the predicted 3D shapes and camera viewpoints can be regularized over time. Here we show an ablation study where we do not use the proposed shape, texture, and part invariance during online adaptation. In the last row, we show the results of this configuration of our model. Observe that for this model, the base shape of the object changes from that of a duck to a bird over time due to occluded observations. This demonstrates the contribution of the proposed temporal invariance losses in stabilizing 3D reconstructions of deformable objects over time. Here we show another example on the bird category. And yet another example. Despite the abrupt change in motion, our model still reconstructs consistent meshes over time. To further evaluate the proposed method quantitatively, we compare mask intersection over union, or IOU, and key point projection accuracy using the PCK metric. Again, I won't go into the details of these evaluations, but the results show that our improved image model outperforms the baseline CMR model for all three metrics, and the online adaptation further improves the model performance as shown in the last column. Furthermore, a comparison of the last two columns demonstrates the effectiveness of the proposed shape, texture, and part invariance modules at improving the reconstruction metrics over time even more. Finally, we show an example on the zebra category, where the proposed method can successfully capture the zebra's walking motion. We note that differently from all prior works that attempt to reconstruct the zebra, our method does not assume any prior model for the articulated motion of the zebra. This is a pragmatic concern for most animal species in the wild that are not well studied. Even without assuming any articulation prior, our method is successful at reconstructing the zebra's motion to some extent. To summarize, in this work, we explored the challenging problem of temporally consistent reconstruction of deformable objects in the wild, for which we don't have any shape or articulation priors. To solve this task, we proposed an improved asymmetric model for single-view reconstruction, which can be applied to each frame of the video. Additionally, we also proposed an online adaptation procedure to fine-tune the single image model to each video using a set of self-supervised temporal constraints. And that brings us to the end of my talk. I thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions. Hi, my name is...
Thanks a lot. That was a very interesting talk with very deep insights into the mechanics of all these methods. While people are thinking about questions to ask in the chat rooms that we have, I have one initial high-level question, and that would be on your part masks. Basically, you have shown that you can use this supervision that comes from SCOPs or these part detection models to improve basically every part of the reconstruction, the temporal consistency, the shape, the camera poses, and so on. And now my question is, if you have thought about the backwards process where you basically get improved masks. I've worked with SCOPs in the past before, and it's working very well, but it sure has some problems every now and then. So maybe there's a way to even use this lifting to 3D to improve the semantic consistency of these part detection models.
Yeah, definitely. So actually, that's a very good question. We had, we did actually experiment with this as well. This exact thing that you mentioned, which is to basically use sort of the average. So we take an average across all the instances in the UV space, right? And so that particular averaging step helps to remove a lot of the noise that SCOPs has. And so we did explore this, and this is certainly possible to sort of incorporate that average UV mask to further improve the segmentation, part segments that you can get out of SCOPs. That's a really good point, yeah.
Thanks. There is one question in the chat from Shangzhe. That is, what are the pros and cons of the texture flow representation for appearance in particular?
Yes. So I think so in practice, what I have found is that the texture flow doesn't always result in very crisp and sharp renderings. It tends to be somewhat blurry for sure. But then the alternative is, having some kind of encoder or a GAN type model that can model the appearance space, right? That's kind of the alternative. And generally, like something like StyleGAN, it can be a lot sharper and give you much better quality now that it has become so good. So that's one disadvantage. The other one is that sometimes the flow can completely collapse. That's what we've observed, right? Like what can happen is that there can be just like a one-to-many mapping, like it just picks up the color from one region of the image instead of sort of having like a many-to-many mapping from RGB to UV. That's another thing that we've observed, that practically you can end up with that sort of a degenerate solution. But like the advantages, as I talked about in the talk, are obviously that it's nice that if you have other annotations besides RGB on the image space, right, you can transfer those as well to UV and sort of align them across instances, which is the nice thing that you can do with the flow representation.
Thanks. There is another question in the chat from So-Young Young, who says, thank you for the great talk. About the template, is there any approach using texture templates? Is there any pattern for the UV map in one category?
So we didn't, but I know that there are concurrent works that use, for example, I know, for example, in particular for the zebra image, which is quite hard. And like for animals, if you observe, they sometimes join the legs together. And that happens a lot because in the UV space, we didn't assume, for example, like an atlas for the object. And what we found was oftentimes for objects that have these deep concavities, like, like the space between the legs of the zebra and so on, it's much helpful to have and use an atlas template, which can help to prevent kind of like these things joining. But then it's a chicken and the egg problem, right? On the one hand, you're dealing with objects that you don't understand well because they're objects in the wild, right? And so so you're trying to come up with a method which is somewhat self-supervised and doesn't assume any priors. But on the other hand, if you do have those priors, they can be helpful, especially if you lay them out as an atlas in the UV space.
Thanks. That makes sense. I don't see. There's another question. Shangzhe asks if predicting XYZ vertices from the input image with CNNs is maybe too challenging, with a viewpoint deformation being entangled in this representation. Do you think that there's a better way to predict this shape?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, definitely. I mean, this is, especially since we're trying to do it from a single view image, there's always this ambiguity, right? You can get both of them wrong and still have the rendered image look right. Yeah, so we, in our work, the only way that we the key points really help to break that ambiguity, right? If you have the key points, and our sort of workaround to getting the key points was using these part segments that we could get in a self-supervised way. Other than that, I mean, having a category prior also helps, as prior work has shown, right? So it's you got to have like some way to break it. Yeah.
Okay.
Symmetry is another one people often use. Yeah. If you have a symmetric object, that is, yeah.
Sure. Perfect. Then I don't see any further questions. Thank you again for the great talk. And I hope you join us for the upcoming panel session that is happening right now.